What if I told you that your biggest struggle in life has never been about failure, rejection, or even trauma? It's about having a mind that 99% of people simply can't understand. A mind that sees what others miss, feels what others suppress, and asks the kind of questions that silence entire rooms. You've spent your whole life being told you're too intense, too deep, too sensitive. But what if those weren't flaws? What if they were signs that you belong to a rare group of individuals Carl Jung spent his entire life studying? In the next few minutes, we're going to break down 8 hidden traits that reveal whether your mind is wired differently from the rest of the world. But this isn't just another personality quiz. This is a psychological deep dive based on the teachings of Carl Jung, Viktor Frankl, and Nietzsche into the kind of mind that's often misunderstood, misdiagnosed, or completely missed by society. By the end of this video, you'll understand why you've always felt like you were walking through life as an outsider. And more importantly, what that actually says about your true identity. So, before we begin, let me ask you a question. Have you ever walked into a room and felt everything? Not just the words being said, but the tensions, the fears, the masks people wear. If so, what you're about to hear might explain the exact thing you've been questioning your whole life. They say intelligence is rare, but they're wrong. Intelligence is common. What's truly rare is the kind of mind that doesn't just absorb information, it interprets existence. A mind that doesn't settle for the visible, but constantly searches for the invisible architecture beneath everything. Carl Jung called it introverted intuition. But make no mistake, it's not just a psychological function. It's a way of being. It's the unseen radar that picks up on frequencies others don't even know exist. If you possess this rare trait, then your mind doesn't operate in isolated facts or events. It weaves patterns. It constructs meaning from chaos. While others are processing what happened, you're already seeing what it implies, how it connects to something from years ago, and what it might cause next week. You don't just remember things, you decode them. Let me give you an example. You hear someone say, "I'm fine." Most people accept the words. You hear the hesitation, you see the flicker in their eye, you feel the dissonance between what's spoken and what's real. You're not trying to read between the lines, you live between the lines. And it's exhausting, because while you're navigating 5 layers of subtext, most people are still stuck on the headline. You're constantly building mental maps in real time of conversations, emotional dynamics, philosophical implications. That's why group settings drain you. You're not participating in one conversation. You're managing the psychology of the room, the energy, the hidden motives, the unsaid. It's not just perception, it's penetration. Jung believed that these minds weren't just rare, they were bridges, translators between the conscious and the unconscious, between symbols and language, between the internal and external world. And perhaps you felt that, the tension of knowing something deeply instinctively, long before you could ever put it into words. But ask yourself, how many times have you stopped trying to explain what you see? Because no one around you can follow. That's not a sign of delusion. It's a sign of rare cognition. And if you've ever doubted your own sanity because your thoughts don't match the noise around you, pause. You're not broken. You're ahead of the curve. And that's exactly why voices like yours are more important than ever. So if this speaks to something in you, if even part of you recognizes what I'm describing, then don't stay invisible. follow this channel, because this is the beginning of a conversation the world desperately needs to have. Most people experience life on a single plane. They hear the words, see the surface move through the world with a kind of functional blindness. But if you have one of these rare minds, you don't just see what's in front of you. You see through it. You experience reality in layers, not because you're trying to, but because your psyche doesn't permit you to stay on the surface. When someone smiles at you, your mind doesn't stop at their teeth. It scans their micro-expressions, feels the discomfort in their tone, senses the unfinished argument still echoing inside them from earlier that day. You're not reading into things. You're perceiving the full spectrum that others filter out. Carl Jung called this psychological depth perception. It's not a skill. It's a burden and a gift. You walk into a room and feel the emotional temperature before anyone speaks. You listen to music and hear the grief the composer tried to hide beneath the rhythm. You read a novel and understand the author's wounds without needing a biography. Reality is never flat for you. It's multidimensional, symbolic, alive, but that's only the surface. Here's where the rupture begins. Because when you try to share what you see, when you put into words, the layered insights, the subtext, the deeper narrative, what do you get? Blank stares, awkward silences, accusations of being dramatic, over-analytical, or too sensitive. In that moment, right there, that's the break, the emotional rupture. It's when you realize the loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being unseen, not for who you pretend to be, but for who you really are. Underneath the layers, you begin to question yourself. Maybe I am reading too much into things. Maybe I am the problem. You mute your insights. You water down your thoughts. You try to blend into a world that was never built for depth. But here's what Jung understood, that society forgot those who feel the most alienated by surface-level living are often the ones most capable of healing it. Not by conforming, but by holding a mirror to it. By showing people that there is more than the literal, the linear, the logical. There is a language beneath the words, a reality beneath the mask. And the fact that you feel so much isn't proof of brokenness. It's the price of consciousness. So next time someone tells you to stop overthinking, what they really mean is stop seeing what I can't. But you can't unknow what you know. You can't flatten a mind built for layers, and you shouldn't. Most people spend their lives running toward the light, comfort, positivity, certainty. But what if your mind has always done the opposite? What if you've been instinctively drawn to the shadows, not out of morbidity, but out of an unshakable need to understand what others refuse to face? Carl Jung called it shadow work, and he believed that no mind can be whole without first confronting its darkness. But here's what most people get wrong. The shadow isn't just about trauma or suppressed emotions. It's the part of the psyche that holds everything we've disowned. Rage, envy, obsession, cruelty, and yes, genius, power, instinct, potential. If you have one of these rare minds, chances are you've never been able to look away from the darkness. While others avoid difficult conversations, you walk straight into them. While others judge the villain, you ask what made them that way. While others flinch from pain, you sit with it, study it, let it speak. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because you understand something most people don't. The fastest way to become dangerous is to pretend you're harmless. You see, the people who avoid their darkness end up being controlled by it. Passive aggressiveness, projection, hypocrisy. Meanwhile, those who acknowledge their shadow, who integrate it, become grounded, clear, impossible to manipulate. But that integration process is brutal, because society doesn't reward those who understand the shadow. It punishes them. You'll be misunderstood. People will assume you're dark, unstable, even threatening, simply because you don't speak in sanitized language. You speak in truth, in complexity, in paradox, and that's terrifying to the average mind. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that's what you've been doing, probably your whole life without even realizing it. But let's be honest, there's a loneliness in that path. When your favorite films are psychological thrillers, when your bookshelf is filled with Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Gabor Mate, when you spend more time thinking about the inner mechanisms of human cruelty than the next trending series on Netflix, it's isolating. But it's also the sign of someone who has stopped pretending that life is only made of light, because real wisdom lives in the tension between light and dark, between the part of you that can nurture and the part that can destroy. And the moment you understand both is the moment you stop being a puppet and start becoming a person. So if you've ever felt guilty for being fascinated by the broken, the twisted, the morally complex, don't apologize. That curiosity is your compass. It's what separates depth from delusion. But there's another consequence of seeing what lies beneath people's behavior. And it leads us to the next trait that makes your mind nearly impossible to understand. You speak a different language, not because you want to, but because your mind was never wired for surface-level communication. You don't just share ideas, you transmit frameworks, emotional data, symbolic meaning, layers of insight that can't be compressed into simple words. And yet, every time you open your mouth, you're met with blank stares, confusion, disconnection, not because what you're saying is wrong, but because most people only speak literal. They're wired for short sentences, quick fixes, easy labels. You, on the other hand, speak the language of meaning. You speak in metaphors, archetypes, emotional currents. Carl Jung called this phenomenon psychological loneliness. It's not the absence of people. It's the inability to be met, to be fully understood, without having to shrink, simplify, or self-edit. Let me ask you something. How many times have you started explaining a thought, paused halfway through and said, "Never mind, it's too much"? Not because it wasn't important, but because you already sensed the other person couldn't follow you there. That isn't arrogance, it's instinct. It's the tragic self-awareness that comes from a lifetime of being met with shallow mirrors when you've always spoken from the depths. And here's the quiet heartbreak most people never see. You long to be understood, not just heard, but recognized. For someone to mirror back the fullness of your thought without you having to cut it into digestible pieces. For someone to say, "I see what you're really saying," and actually mean it. But that rarely comes. So you learn to write instead of speak. You find refuge in books and solitude, in long drives, where you can finish your sentences without interruption. You connect with music, with poetry, with silence, because silence never misunderstands you. And yet, despite all of this, you still try. Because your nature is to bridge. to translate, to reach across the gap between inner and outer worlds. You become the interpreter for yourself and for others, the one who gives voice to what everyone feels, but no one can articulate. But that comes at a cost, because the more fluent you become in the symbolic and emotional language of the unconscious, the more foreign you become to the world around you, and the lonelier it gets when no one speaks your dialect back. Jung understood this tension. He believed that the truly individuated person walks a paradox. They are of the world, but not in it in the same way. They participate, but they never quite belong. You know exactly what that feels like. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because this inability to fully explain yourself to others, it doesn't just frustrate your relationships, it also reshapes how you think. It changes how you solve problems, and it leads directly to the next trait that makes your cognition so difficult for others to grasp. You've probably been told to be more rational. Maybe it was during an argument. Maybe it was at school when your answers didn't follow the neat formulas the system demanded. Or maybe it was something more subtle, the way people looked at you when you trusted your gut instead of following the flowchart. But here's the truth. Carl Jung understood that most modern minds still miss. Some of the most powerful insights you'll ever have will not come from logic. They will come from knowing before knowing makes sense. You see, rare minds like yours don't operate in straight lines. They move in spirals. You don't follow logic like a ladder. You sense patterns like a landscape. You connect dots that others don't even recognize as dots yet. And to someone trapped in binary thinking, that makes you unpredictable, unreliable, even irrational. But you're not irrational. You're transrational. Jung called this intuitive logic, a way of perceiving that synthesizes emotion, unconscious symbols, archetypal patterns, and yes, rational analysis, but not in isolation, in harmony. And that harmony often looks like chaos to anyone stuck in linear problem solving. Think about it. How many times have you felt something was wrong, even when all the facts said otherwise? How many times have you sensed the truth inside a contradiction where logic failed, but your whole being whispered, "This is real"? That's not guesswork. That's deep cognition. It's a form of knowing that transcends the rigidity of logic, not because logic is bad, but because it's incomplete on its own. Nietzsche once said, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." That chaos he speaks of isn't confusion, it's complexity. And your mind thrives in complexity. You hold paradox instead of rejecting it. You tolerate ambiguity where others demand closure. You feel your way through problems while others calculate. And the price of that, you often have to defend decisions you know are right, but can't immediately prove. You sense what's broken in a system, but can't explain it with a slide deck. You feel like you're constantly explaining why your process looks nothing like the one everyone else calls smart. So you're underestimated, misunderstood, maybe even dismissed. But what they don't realize is that your discomfort with logic isn't a limitation. It's a higher form of intelligence. It's the ability to hold truth that hasn't yet been measured, to see meaning that can't yet be mapped, because life isn't a spreadsheet. It's a symphony, and the most beautiful minds are the ones who can hear more than one instrument at a time. But when you can hear all those instruments, when your mind processes not just logic, but emotion, instinct, memory, symbolism, and fear, something else happens. You begin to see through people, and that leads us straight into the next trait. Everyone wears a mask. That's not a cynical observation. It's a psychological truth. Society teaches us early on how to present a version of ourselves that's acceptable, likable, safe. But if you have one of these rare minds, you've always had the uncanny ability to see through the performance. Carl Jung called it the persona, the social mask we wear to survive. But what he also taught is that behind every persona lies a deeper self, one most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You, on the other hand, seem to detect it instantly. You notice the twitch beneath the smile, the hesitation before someone answers, the contradiction between someone's words and their energy. While others are busy responding to what's being said, your mind is already mapping what's being hidden, and that makes people uncomfortable because they can feel it, your presence. Not aggressive, not judgmental, just piercing. The kind of gaze that doesn't just look at someone but looks into them. And for many, that's terrifying. Most people spend so much energy maintaining their masks, they don't know who they are without them. But when you enter the room, the mask stops working. You become a mirror, not the kind that flatters, the kind that reflects back truth. Fear, shame, longing, the parts of themselves they'd rather not see. And this is why so many of your social experiences feel strained. Why people open up to you too quickly or shut down completely. It's not random. You're accessing parts of them they haven't integrated yet. But here's the painful irony. Even though you see people clearly, they rarely see you. Because while you're decoding their emotional language, they're still stuck on small talk. You're meeting them at their core while they're still asking what you do for a living. And so you carry the weight of understanding everyone while rarely feeling understood yourself. But don't confuse this with weakness. Jung believed that those who can perceive what's behind the mask are also the ones most capable of healing the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. You don't just reveal what's false, you hold space for what's real to emerge. That's why people confess things to you they've never told anyone. Why strangers sense they can trust you. Why you're drawn to depth, vulnerability, rawness, because you know that's where real connection lives. But when you live in a world of masks, and you're one of the few who doesn't wear one convincingly, the result isn't just social fatigue. It's a kind of existential ache, and that ache leads us directly into the next trait. You can be surrounded by people loved, even, and still feel like you're the only one who knows what's really happening. Not just in the room, but in life. The music plays. The laughter sounds real. The conversation flows. And yet, somewhere beneath it all, there's a silence only you can hear. A gap between the world and your perception of it. That's not social loneliness. That's something deeper. Carl Jung called it existential loneliness. This isn't about not having friends. It's about not having mirrors. Because when your mind operates beyond convention, when you question the structure of reality, when you feel the weight of every passing moment, when beauty moves you to tears and suffering turns into questions no one else dares ask, something shifts. You stop belonging, not because you don't want to, but because what most people call normal begins to feel like an insult to the complexity you live with every day. You crave depth, but are met with distraction. You bring up mortality, and someone changes the subject. You try to express how absurd and beautiful and tragic life is, and they respond with a meme or a shrug. So, you turn inward. Books become your companions. Solitude becomes your sanctuary. You find fragments of yourself in poetry, in symphonies and silent moments, under a sky that doesn't need to explain itself. And still there's that ache. Not for company, but for communion. It's the pain of being aware in a world addicted to anesthesia, the loneliness of insight, the burden of vision. Jung believed this ache wasn't pathology, it was maturity, a sign that the psyche had outgrown the structures designed to keep it numb. Viktor Frankl wrote that man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life. But what happens when no one around you is searching? When you look into the eyes of those you love and realize they're not asking the same questions, you start to feel like a different species, and that feeling can crush you. Or it can awaken you, because existential loneliness, while brutal, is also the threshold. It's the doorway between the false self and the true one, between imitation and individuation, between drifting with the current and rising above it. It doesn't get easier, but it does get clearer. You begin to accept that maybe you weren't meant to fit in. Maybe you were meant to see what others miss, to feel what others suppress, to articulate what others avoid. And in doing so, maybe you become the very thing you've always needed to find in someone else. But what if this ache, this aloneness, this depth wasn't the end of the road? What if it was the very thing guiding you toward your final transformation? There are people who seek comfort, stability, predictability. They build lives around avoiding risk, avoiding pain, avoiding anything that threatens the version of themselves they've decided to be. But then there's you. And you've always been different. Because even when life was good, safe, familiar, manageable, something inside you whispered, "This isn't it." Not because you're ungrateful, not because you're restless, but because you were never wired to maintain. You were born to transform. Carl Jung called this process individuation, not self-improvement, not optimization. Individuation, the radical, often brutal journey of becoming your true self by integrating everything you've been taught to avoid. The shadow, the fear, the contradictions, the chaos. You feel this call not as a choice, but as a necessity. While others run from breakdowns, you move toward them. While others numb their pain, you ask it questions. While others reconstruct the mask, you tear it off over and over again until what remains isn't pretty but real. This isn't about becoming better. It's about becoming whole. That's why comfort feels suffocating. Why predictable routines turn into cages. Why every time you try to settle down, some deep instinct inside you begins to decay. You weren't made to repeat. You were made to shed. Nietzsche once said, "The snake, which cannot shed its skin, must perish." And that's what this is. Every few years you die. Not physically, psychologically, spiritually. And each time you emerge with less illusion, less fear, less pretense, and more clarity. But it's not glamorous. Transformation means loss. It means walking away from relationships that once defined you. It means letting go of beliefs you once built your life around. It means looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back, yet choosing to meet them anyway. And the world won't understand. People will ask why you're always reinventing yourself. Why you can't just be happy. Why you're drawn to depth intensity and uncomfortable truths, but they don't see what you see. They don't feel what you feel. Because transformation is your nature, not a phase, not a rebellion, a rhythm, a sacred contract between your soul and something ancient, invisible, and undeniable. Jung believed that those who walk this path become bridges between worlds. They carry wisdom most can't access simply because they've walked through fires most won't face. They're not better than others, but they are different. And if you've made it this far, through every rupture, every shadow, every silence and mask and ache and death and rebirth, then maybe you're not just different. Maybe you're part of the 1%. The question is, what will you do with that knowing? So now, you know, you're not too intense, not too sensitive, not too complicated. You simply have a mind that 99% of people can't understand. And that's not a curse. It's a responsibility. You see patterns others miss. You live in layers others don't even know exist. You're drawn to the shadow, not to get lost in it, but to illuminate it. You speak in symbols. Think beyond logic, pierce through masks, and carry the ache of a deeper reality few are willing to face. But in doing so, you've become something rare, not broken, evolved. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." You're already on that path, so the next time you feel alone, remember this: you're not alone in feeling alone. There's a silent tribe of rare minds scattered across the world. Minds like yours navigating the same shadows, asking the same questions, carrying the same fire. And this space, this channel, it was built for people like you. So if this message spoke to something real inside, you don't just let it fade. Follow, subscribe, comment. Let others know they're not the only ones. Because when rare minds find each other, the world changes. And it starts right here,